Hello everybody, today we're going to be into lesson 2 of biology. This is the biodiversity section of the booklet. So we're going to just go through some of these notes and see if I can enhance them a little bit for you as we go. So the range of life in an area is determined by the number of different species in that area. So that's biodiversity. Diversity is really related to both the combination of species, so like the different types of organisms, also the genetic diversity of those organisms. So within a family, how different is each organism from each other? And then the ecosystem itself. So how different are the pieces of that area from one another? And diversity here is like differences. So how many different sort of food networks and organizations of food pyramids and things like that are there in these areas. Evolutionary change is in terms of evolutionary biology. We look at evolutionary change as being the cause of this biodiversity. So different areas of the world under different evolutionary factors have over time created the biodiversity we see today. So we got many different species that live in a forest, for example. So there's lots of different species. So that's the part of the species diversity. But how many different types of deer do you have? How many different types of foxes? How many different types of birds? That's going to either, if there are few types of birds or foxes, Manitoba has a lot of white-tailed deer. But do we have other types of deer? Do we see moose and other organisms that are in the same sort of niche? That's like other organisms that share the same types of foods. And then are there variations within those groups? Are there variations between the areas that we're talking about? So in a certain range of a area, so let's say southern Manitoba or something. What kind of ecologies are there? There's marshlands, there's man-made farmlands. There are there other ones we can think of, the sandy lands, things like that. Those are ecosystems that are in there. And then we would talk about the genetic diversity. How different are any two deer that you catch? Do they have different shapes or horns or differences in their features, or are they genetically similar? The more similar they are, the less diverse they are. So species diversity, number of species found in an ecosystem. Large numbers of different species indicate greater diversity. So that's the greater diversity. Greater diversity is typically viewed as more stable and more resistance to change. So we don't want, what we hope is that the world will continue to be full of life over time. And if a certain area of the world is filled with similar species, then we would expect that those similar species would have the chance of going extinct or of decreasing in population very rapidly under the same factor. So thinking about something like climate change. Climate change means that there's a change in the climate in that area. That change in the climate will have a different impact on different species. Some species will be lost very rapidly if there's a small change in climate. Other species might be more robust. Human beings are obviously much more robust because we have technology, so we will be able to adapt to things. But if the world was to eventually become just human beings, well, that would not be a very diverse world, and it would be an ecologically poor world, a biodiversity poor world, and we don't want that to happen. So tropical rainforests are seen as highly diverse because they have long growing seasons. Lots of different plants and organisms are able to live there, but we also find some of our most fragile organisms, some organisms that are only found in those rainforests. And so when we see other changes like cutting down of rainforests, those species are lost, and we have a greater loss to the world's overall biodiversity when there's that sort of damage. So biodiversity, so we could also compare this to the tundra, where there's a lack of food, a lack of various different things for organisms to eat. which has resulted in a lack. This lack of resources resulted in a lack of species diversity. Sometimes we refer to things like biodiversity hotspots. These are places on Earth that have particularly high levels of diversity, and so by their high levels of diversity, we should think from a conservation perspective about ways to save those places from trauma, like especially human instigated trauma, like oil spills or pollution or deforestation. So we want to keep those places rich in life. They have high levels of diversity, so that means that there is a high concentration of a variety of organisms, variety of species, variety of ecosystems that are going to feed those organisms, keep them healthy, and keep our Earth diverse. Genetic diversity refers to genes and traits. These are the information stored inside your cells that gives you that determines characteristics. So let's just put that out there because we haven't talked about genes yet. So genes, these are the information found in cells that determines the traits of the organism. Different genes give or different traits. So higher genetic diversity means a larger range of traits in the species, in the population. So I'm going to refer to population here to mean that the population here is to sort of indicate the group that's reproducing, that's living together, that's in the same underneath the same sort of stresses, living in the same sort of environment. Larger diversity of traits means a better chance of survival, and that's what we're going to talk about as we go down this page. So the variety of genes or traits that are expressed in particular organisms and variations in sizes, behaviors, abilities, across a breeding population. Phenotype refers to the obvious characteristics. So phenotypes are things like size and behavior, and color or resistance to disease. Those are the active. Those are the genes in their active state. The collection of these genetic traits is also known as a gene pool. And so a more diverse gene pool is like a larger gene pool. It has more genes floating in it that you might be able to pick up when you're combined together to form a new organism. Genetic diversity in populations. The greater the genetic diversity that exists, the greater the chances the population will survive. Not everyone will survive, but the more differences in genes, the more likely there's going to be at least one survivor out there. And so that's an important factor in determining, that's an important factor in sort of the survivability of that species. Environmental changes. So environmental change is inevitable. So when a population has enough genetic diversity, some members will survive the change and reproduce. If the genetic diversity is low, which is the case in inbreeding or genetic isolation or very small populations due to other factors like hunting or like overhunting, predation, then in that case, the small genetic diversity means that all of them are susceptible to the same effect. In this case, that means that a small change in climate might affect all of them equally, reducing all of the organisms in that population's chance of survival, and that population could be eliminated. And that's the case with things like coral reefs, where pollution changes the pH in the water, and that change in the pH affects organisms in that coral. If all of the coral is the same genetic diversity, then all the coral is affected equally. The hope is that there's high biodiversity in those genetic hotspots, and those biodiversity hotspots where those small changes aren't affecting them as much. But if the changes continue, then even a high diversity system might collapse. Now, ecosystem diversity, this is the variety of ecosystems that could exist on Earth or in an area. So, we should say exist on Earth, or refers to the diversity in a specific area of the world. So sometimes, this is an option that as a biologist, you can sort of choose. You can't study the whole globe at all times. So instead, you might be only studying Manitoba, or you might only be studying the areas around Lake Winnipeg or Lake Manitoba. And so as you study those areas around that area, you'll be interested in what combinations of ecosystems are available, how diverse they are, because those diversity in those ecosystems is going to allow for organisms to move between those different ecosystems, and possibly one ecosystem that might be affected by a change the other ecosystem will not be changed as much. So I'm thinking about an example like Lake Manitoba. You have the ecosystem of the sort of swampiness right next to the water, so the low still waters that are next to the lake, compared to the marshlands that surround it, and then might surround the lake, as well as the deeper water in the lake that is even more different. So you could think of those as three different ecosystems that a frog could live in. A frog, being a small creature, doesn't have a large roaming area, so instead they would be moving they could move over time between these three different areas. They can move to the marshlands if the shores would become polluted. They could move into the shores of the lake if the marshlands are dried out to make farmland. So the diversity there, having the availability of these three different ecosystems in close proximity to each other, increases the odds that a frog will survive. If we did not have that, and we say we were analyzing frogs that are found only in marshlands, then we of course are going to have a different problem, where there's now less diversity, and so that's going to create less options for those frogs. So I'm going to put a little bit of this sort of thing, and then let's get some grass going, get some low marshlands over here. So we got some marshland, we have the shoreline, and then we could even have sort of the deeper water lake. So this is sort of three areas of diversity that we could probably put our little froggies in here, and I'm going to give them did I get the eyes right? Okay, well, you know what am I doing? We need a new. There, that's a frog, right? That's of course Kermit the Frog is what I was going for. So Kermit could live here, or he could live here, or he could live here. So when farmers come in to take away the marshlands, then all of a sudden he still has the option to live in the shorelands. If someone comes and starts, building on the shores, putting houses and things like that, the frogs can start to live more inwards towards the middle of the lake, or move across the lake to the other shore. But if we take away all of those options, and there's a less diversity, if they just leave the lake, like retention ponds in manufactured neighborhoods, then the options for that frog and the survivability of that frog become less likely. So we can have, this is sort of, so diversity of ecosystem gives life options. And if you have to ever consider, I think we covered all these ideas here, some ecosystems are found all over the world, but not all of them are identical. That's another thought to think about. Some ecosystems are similar and closely connected. Those frogs that are living in this lake that we made up, they might even be able to move across to another lake or be relocated by biologists or conservationists. But we can have rainforests all around the world, and even though they're the same rainforest, we'll actually find that there are different species inside, although those species are often found to be sharing in certain characteristics. And that's another concept we'll talk about at another time, called the niche that those organisms occupy. Even organisms that exist in the Rocky Mountains are definitely not the same as Himalayans, and that's another factor. That's a factor left over from evolutionary theory about why these organisms are slightly different in different parts of the world. If we want to look at the whole world, we can think about the whole world as the biosphere. That's all the ecosystems and all the diversity in the world, and water is essentially at the heart of that. Water powers all of our ecosystems. All of the living organisms essentially depend on water for life, and water goes in and out of all organisms, and so it is the most essential piece, especially because it carries with it the nutrients like sugars and proteins and all those factors to the cells of those organisms. So without water we have nothing, or we don't have life on Earth at least. Now, one factor I really want to try to stress is that the resistance to change is through diversity. So as the world changes, as an environment changes, whether it's by human impact or by natural causes, the effect of the change the way that it impacts the world, the way that it impacts the organisms is going to depend on two things: the magnitude of the change and the diversity of the affected population or ecology. Now, maybe I should actually include, I just realized there's another one, the magnitude and duration. Right? So something like a volcano can have a disastrous effect on the ecology on an island. An island could be completely changed by the impacts of a volcano. There are even examples of entire islands that have essentially been wiped clean by natural disasters. There are examples of islands where all the population on the island is eliminated after every tsunami. And those islands have actually been identified as great test sites for exploring ecology. And there are some islands that are now designated as conserved test zones, where they actually introduce certain organisms and certain populations of organisms to those islands, knowing that those islands are essentially wiped clean whenever a tsunami season sort of arrives, or an extreme tsunami season especially. So they can go to those islands, let a whole bunch of organisms grow, and then they can come back and test them for a couple of years at a time. And then when the giant tsunami comes, which comes in sort of cyclical ways every couple of decades, they know that the island will be wiped clean and the human impact has been very minimal. Sort of a strange idea to let a whole bunch of organisms grow in harmony and then knowing that one day they'll be wiped clean, but that is one of the ways that biology has been studying ecology. So let's look at something like ocean warming. So ocean warming is something that's happening slowly, and it is increasing in very small temperature changes, but it's also a continuous thing that's happening for a long period of time. So the high diversity, if we have a high diversity population, then there's going to be many different fish with lots of different genetic diversity, and within those populations of fish, because of the high genetic diversity, their relationship to temperature is also diverse. That means that some of the fish, if we had to think about them as a population, populations are often represented this way, there's going to be a group of them that are affected by change, and then there's going to be a group that are unaffected. But if you make the population more diverse, like something like this, then the number that are unaffected increases. If you make it less diverse, like so, then the number that are unaffected decreases. So more diverse, a wider range of abilities and a wider range of genetics means that there will be more unaffected species, a narrower range of genetics, and there will be more affected species. So we can read here, different individuals are either more or less sensitive to the water temperature. If the ocean temperature increases, it will only eliminate the small portion of sensitive fish. Low diversity, this group all have the same or similar sensitivity. So that's what I'm trying to represent here. So this is my similar sensitivity. All right, so this will be my low diversity group. And so they are all affected. And nearly all of them are affected. And so those ones that are affected are essentially eliminated, and we only get to save the small portion of them. If the diversity is high, maybe I'm going to redraw this image here. Okay. I want to do it with color this time. All right. So let's call this will be high diversity. High diversity. So it's broad. And this one, and we'll do another one for low diversity, which will be something that looks like this. Okay, so more population is in the average. Low diversity. And then we're going to say that this is the temperature change. So the temperature change, orange for temperature, for getting hot. So this is where the temperature change happens. And so notice that the temperature change for the purple square, the purple line, is most of that shape. So the low diversity shape is mostly affected. The high diversity shape in red is less affected because there's more of the population, more individuals. All of these are individuals out here. There's more individuals outside of this affected zone. If we had flooding in Manitoba, for another example, we could, flooding. Manitoba used to have a wide range of ecologies, but including vast amounts of forests and wetlands, but they were all converted into farmlands in the last 2 centuries. So previously, we had lots of different diverse ecologies. So then when spring flooding season happened, the wetlands could actually absorb extra water, and it would prevent the flooding of the forests or the flooding of the other ecologies, maybe even the sandy lands, for example. When we hit the low ecology, when we have low ecology, we have lots of farmland and not a lot else. Now, when the waters come in for flooding, they don't have the wetlands to absorb them, and so the water is now transmitted to the farmlands, and those farmlands get flooded, and they flood into the trees and forests, and they kill the forests off as well. So the damage is spread, and it's much more disastrous because the diversity is low. So the ecological diversity is low. And so that's something to think about. I think we're going to end our video here. This is a good point to stop. And in the next section, we're going to talk about species. So hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll talk about this more in the next video.